Hey guys, Chevy Sergeant here. Today we're going to be going over the GM factory ratchet shifter. This came in Pontiacs, Camaros, etc. Showing you here, it's got that side-to-side play, which is what the typical factory ratchet shifter has. Just kind of going over here, showing the components, how it's assembled. Again, I'm recording this audio after the fact, so just bear with me here. But kind of going around assembly here. So as you look, you bring it back all the way to first. You kind of click over and up, and if you notice, there's these little notches on the opposing side. You can kind of see these little notches sticking outward, and it's catching those with a little tooth, which is allowing it or preventing it from over shifting if you're using that ratchet function or gate function. So when you push it over to the right, it catches those little outward notches and keeps you from over shifting. It's a pretty neat little feature. Okay, getting into the functionality again here. On the other side of the shifter, you can kind of see these little indentations. So there's a little rod that is attached to the push button, and that rod is spring loaded, and so when you pull the shifter back or push it forward, that rod, when you let go of the button, it springs up and catches in one of those little notches, which locks it into the gear you're in. And when you push the button, it releases it from those notches and allows you to move it. So those are more the like gates it has. Those aren't the gates that you'd use for like the slap shift feature. Those are the gates that it has normally from just going like from like park to reverse to neutral. So you can kind of see right here that rod, trying to get a good angle on it. When you depress the button, that rod goes in and out. There you go. There's the motion there. So that's what catches those gates as you're shifting back and forth. And that rod was actually bent on mine, which was preventing it from grabbing those gates, which is what I'll show you later on in the video when I tear it down and disassemble it. I'll show you how to fix that. So if yours isn't locking in the gates, that's why that rod's probably bent. You'll see like scrape marks inside the shifter and things of that nature. So we'll move on to the disassembly here in just a second. Moving on to the disassembly here, first thing you're going to need is a 7/16 socket. That's what's going to be needed to remove this upper plate. So go ahead and zip those 3 bolts out that are holding the upper plate on. Once you get the plate off, you kind of flip the thing around. There's a few different components under here that we're going to have to start to remove. There's a spring, which I'm pointing to right there. That is the spring that compresses against the button that you'd press to switch gears. I don't know what you want to actually call that. The rod to decompress the gear, or decompress it and move it through the gears. So I'm kind of just using a pick right now, and I'm trying to get that spring unhooked from that rod so I can release the tension on that rod. So I'm kind of just using a pick, pry it off of there. It's a little bit tricky, especially getting it back on. We're going to get it out of the way first. After you get that spring out of the way, there's a little pin with a cotter key on that mechanism that the rod's sitting in. We're going to slide the rod, or you're going to get the rod to slide out, you have to remove that pin and that cotter key, and then that'll allow you to get enough slack to get the rod out. I apologize for the bad camera angle here, but essentially I unhooked the spring from the top of the rod and was able to pop it out. That's what that looks like. And then once you get that spring out, again, that rod should be free like it is there. And then you got to get this little pin, release the cotter key from the pin, and get the pin out, that whole mechanism will kind of separate, allow you to get the actual actuating rod out of there. It's under a little bit of tension here because of the other spring that allows the side-to-side motion of the rod. So it's a little bit tricky to get that little locking rod out with the tension it has on it. So just be aware of that. It's something you're going to have to kind of play with when you go to reassemble it as well. So keep that in mind. Now that that pin's out, this rod can slide out freely. And this is the rod I was mentioning earlier that gets bent, and it's got that little U shape in it, and it actually gets bowed outward, which keeps it from fully engaging. So as you can see, mine's kind of squished inward a little bit. That's actually how I had to bend it, because it was kind of bent outward more than it should have been. So I took some pliers and I squeezed it inward and made it a tighter U, if that makes sense. So by doing that, that allowed it to engage properly, because it was actually rubbing against the housing of the shifter and grinding away metal, and it was making a really loud like grinding noise. It wouldn't lock into the gates, and none of it functioned properly. So again, I kind of just squished it inward, had to play with it a little bit, and then reassembled it, tried it, and then I did a full tear down and cleaning, which is what I'm doing in this video here. Next thing you're going to do is go through and just take out all the other bolts. So there's like these little plastic caps, not caps, little sliders that you see right here, those little white pieces. And you have to take the bolts out of those to get that assembly apart. That's going to be a 3/8 socket for those bolts. I was kind of learning as I went here, so I flipped it around, took the other side out, and was just trying to figure out kind of how everything came apart. But you just go ahead and take those two bolts that go in those little plastic guides, and you take those out on each side, and that'll free up a lot of the components inside the shifter. With all four bolts out, that center mechanism's kind of free and can slide out the part of the assembly that the actuating rod slides through. Can come out fairly easy after that. This assembly comes apart fairly easy. There's kind of like a little spring that attaches to the chrome rod and to the, I guess, base plate of that assembly. And then there's another spring that is for the side-to-side motion that kind of pops out. And it can be a little tricky getting back in, but it's not too bad. Sorry about all like off-camera work here. I was kind of trying to work on this in video at the same time. Wasn't really paying attention to where my camera was. You can kind of see that first spring I was talking about here. It's just got like one little pin that sits in the chrome rod that keeps it in place. So I just used a pick and just kind of popped it out, and then it slides right off of the assembly. And then the other spring, once the upper spring is out, the other spring kind of just pry out, and that whole assembly will come apart. Sorry for my lack of terminology here. Like I said, that's that little spring mechanism that you'd see that engages one set of the gates, kind of slides off. And then this plate, again, it slides off as well. You just have to pop that larger spring out of the assembly there. very carefully without shooting it across the room. Going back to the shifter housing here, those little plastic guides, they kind of just pop out after all the bolts are out. And then you can clean up inside of there. So I kind of went through, once those were out, I just kind of wire brushed the whole thing, cleaned it, painted it, and then cleaned up all the little individual pieces before I reassembled it. And then after I reassembled it, went through, greased everything. You'll see that later on in the video here. Right here you can kind of see where the actuating rod was scraping against the housing of the shifter from where it was bent out. Some pretty deep gouges in there. So I cleaned those up a little bit. I probably should have sanded them down some, tried to smooth them out, but I actually forgot to do that step, but the shifter seems to operate fine. I did clean up in there really well, wiped everything out really nice, but this is what I was talking about. That rod goes through there, and where it was, that little point on the edge of it was bent out, scraping against the actual housing. So if you're running into that, like I said, that rod's probably bent and needs to be bent inward to prevent that from happening. I didn't really mess with taking the side components off there. They weren't really in my way for the main moving parts. There's just a couple pins and things that hold those in place, so I wasn't too worried about taking those out. They weren't super vital to getting the assembly fixed and everything. They're easy to grease. If you want to take them off, you can, but like I said, they're pretty self-explanatory. Just a couple pins and they slide right out. Right here, I'm kind of just going through, wiping down all the components, getting them cleaned up. I'm not going overboard. I mean, you could use some brake clean if you wanted to, but this rag was just fine for what I was doing. I'm not going for like a full restoration. I was just doing a quick and dirty overhaul, make the shifter a little smoother, work a little better for the car. Once I kind of cleaned everything up, this is where I took the wire wheel and just lightly went over the housing, and I'm just trying to get some of the scale and grime off before I painted it. Didn't really need to paint it, but I just wanted to add to the cosmetic effects of it, maybe keep it from rusting anymore, things of that nature. So this is kind of an optional step here. Moving on to paint here, kind of set everything up, gave it a light dust coat of paint. You can see the shifter bezel there, it was still kind of drying, but got it up out of the way, dusted some paint on it, and moved on to the reassembly. And yes, the shifter housing looked like crap right there. I was using some cheap rattle can. I ended up going back over it, made it look a little different afterwards, but we'll get to that later. Reiterating myself again here, but I'm just kind of showing how I went about bending that in. Just a little bit of pressure there. Bent that in just slightly. Just enough to keep it from rubbing from the sides. So it's kind of how it looked after it was bent. You don't want to overdo it, but you also need to make sure you have that bend in there. So going back to the assembly, that chrome rod just slides back in there. You're going to put the big spring, the little spring back in place, and we're just essentially doing the reverse of the disassembly. And I'll go ahead and show you guys the process of this as well, in case there's anything you missed in the first go around or my poor filming capabilities caused any misunderstanding of what's going on here. I actually put this little spring back on first and got it hooked in place so that it kind of helps hold the assembly together just a little bit. I don't think it really matters what order you put it back on. It's just the way I chose to do it. I was fighting getting the tab over the rod here. I kept hooking it on like a dummy. It's got that slight little pin on that spring that just hooks into the little hole that's in the chrome tube. And then you kind of twist the assembly around. It's got to be able to have that kind of tension on it so this kind of slap shift function will spring back when you spring it over to the right. Well, that's not the same function. That's the Sorry, that's the gate function for when you're using the slap shifter function. That little rotary piece there, that little spring that I'm rotating, is what engages the gates that prevent it from overshifting, if that makes sense. So it has to be able to have that spring tension on there when it rotates. If it's make sure it's hooked up properly, otherwise it won't work properly. It's pretty self-explanatory. If you took it apart, just put it back the same way it was. Just pay close attention when you do take it apart. Now I'm putting these plastic guides back in. It doesn't really matter which side you put them in. They're both identical, so they can go in either way. You can go ahead and slide the shifter tube assembly back in place once the springs are in place on it. Start putting those screws back in. I like to put those back in before I go and put the engagement rod back in, I should say. So we'll get the main assembly put back together there. Again, I believe those were 3/8 bolts. Thread those in on both sides, and we'll move on to putting the rod back in, and then the pin and a cotter key, all that good stuff, and you'll be halfway to being assembled. If you notice, I actually tried to put the larger spring back in place after I slid the assembly back in the shifter, which wasn't actually the best move. I don't know why I decided to try to do it that way, but the best thing to do is put that spring in place before you slide that mechanism down in the shifter. It just makes things easier. For whatever reason, I don't know why I thought that was a good idea to slide the spring in after I reassembled it, when that's not how I disassembled it. So took it back out, installed that larger spring. Don't make the same mistake I did. This was the first time I disassembled one of these. So just kind of learning as I went here. But you see, I kind of just pushed the spring in place. It's a little bit difficult. Fought with it for a second. Easier to come out than easier to go in. But not too bad. Now it's ready to slide back into the assembly. Now that the bolts are put back in place, we can slide the actuating rod back in. Now there's a little bit of a trick to this. That little rotating spring assembly part that I showed you earlier that has a little pin that slides in the chrome rod. So that assembly has to be twisted. So I'll show it here. This little piece, it has to be twisted to line up with the edge of the rod here. So you have to slide that over. You can see the motion I'm doing here. It's got to line up with that gap so that rod can sit up between the slot that's in that little bracket there, that little metal piece that's on that spring. So you have to rotate that by hand, try to hold it in place as you slide the actuating rod into the assembly. It's a little bit tricky, not too bad. If you overbent the rod, it's not going to want to sit in there right. But it pops up in that little notch in that metal piece that's spring loaded. So the spring's not super strong. It's pretty easy. You can do it one finger, but either way, you need to make sure that piece is lined up in order for the rod to be able to slide into the groove there. Once the rod's in place, you got to put that spring back in. So I like to hook the upper part in first, and it's this part's kind of tricky. You have to put the upper part in first, and then you have to try to hook the lower section onto the rod. I'm fighting it here, trying to get the upper part in, but I kept like snagging it and jamming it on stuff. So get it through, hooked on the top, and then try to hook it on back onto that rod. So I'm grabbing it with the pick here, trying to pry it back up onto that engagement rod. Once that spring's back in place, you can go ahead and put the locking pin back in place. Kind of just have to push the piece back in place, get the pin to line up, put the cotter key back in, and it should be good to go. It's back to functioning like normal. Now I'm going to have to go through and grease it. I'm just kind of checking through, making sure all of the gates are functioning properly, the rod's engaging like it should. Hear that distinctive click, and like I said, it should be locked in most of those gates unless you depress the actuating rod. So as long as all that stuff checks out, then you're ready to move on to the grease stage. I just took my grease gun and put a little bit of grease in all the moving parts. I'm sure any kind of grease, automotive grease would work, wheel bearing grease, etc. This is just what I had. So this is just my automotive grease gun, putting a little bit in, kind of rubbed it around, moved the shifter back and forth, got everything worked in really nice. Again, I went through all the moving parts and did this. Once I greased everything, it felt like a brand new shifter. It was a much smoother, a lot less noise, and it just felt like an overall way better experience than before I disassembled it. I also made sure to apply some grease inside the casing where the actuating rod was rubbing against the casing in case it starts to rub again for whatever reason. There's simply some grease in there, so just anywhere that there's moving parts or contact with moving parts, I tried to grease, prevent from any excessive wear and tear or any kind of friction that it may have. After I greased it all, the shifter seemed to be a lot smoother, a lot less grindy. It's overall just a lot better experience. So that concludes this video. I'll go ahead and show a final product after paint, and I'll see you guys next time.